Hey, changemakers! Thank you for tuning into the Hacking the Patriarchy podcast. I'm your fervent feminist host, Raven O'Neill, and I get the honors of sitting down weekly with diverse experts from all walks of life to explore ideas, opportunities, and strategies that we can all use to hack our way to better lives within patriarchal societies. If you're ready to hack patriarchal systems and structures, I invite you to join us and help move the needle. I'm excited to introduce you to today's guest, Corrie LoGiudice. Corrie helps women in the workforce become confident leaders and entrepreneurs by identifying and addressing their overwhelm culprit. As an inspirational keynote speaker, coach, and facilitator, Corrie has been featured in major media outlets such as TEDx, Girl Boss, Business Insider, Thrive Global, and The Mighty. Through her keynotes, workshops, and coaching programs, she shows women how to transform overwhelm into extraordinary action no matter their circumstances and validate they can confidently step into roles that allow them to have a lasting impact. Corrie, her husband, their 4 children, and 2 cats live 45 minutes from Midtown Manhattan and 10 minutes from the beach on Long Island, New York. Please give Corrie a super warm welcome. Welcome, Corrie. I am honored to have you on the show today. We are diving into overwhelm and how that affects leadership. So I think a great starting place is to just hear a little bit about your background, how you came into this work, and then we can start looking at it.
You got it. So my background, I worked for over 15 years in my former career as a senior vice president. I was the 3rd generation running my family's very large regional electronics distribution company. And I was the only woman and youngest person in the whole industry, it seemed. And I loved it. I loved everything that I was doing. I loved the work I did. I'm a natural entrepreneur, with that said. But I went through a phase in only 5 years where I experienced basically every kind of trauma that most women could possibly experience, ranging from having a miscarriage to leaving an abusive marriage to having a very highly contentious divorce. And then even past that, surviving a suicide loss. I lost my post-divorce partner to suicide. And having to navigate all of these very traumatic events in addition to working full-time as a senior vice president, and at the time too, I was a single mother of an infant. So overwhelmed, I definitely understand what it's like to have absolutely zero idea where to start. And how I ended up doing the work that I'm doing today is during this time frame, I was working with a therapist who was really pivotal in my life for me. She had helped me initially navigate the abusive relationship and then create my life post-divorce. And at one point, she had mentioned to me in passing that she's like, Corrie, you have a really natural ability to continue to push forward. Regardless of your overwhelming circumstances, I have patients that can't do what it is that you're doing. If you could figure out how, create a framework or something like that, you can have a really huge impact on people. And at that point in time, she was trying to, talk me into maybe leaving the family business, pursuing a different career, becoming a coach, that kind of thing, because we felt that that was kind of rooted in some of the overwhelm I was feeling, that there was a disconnect there. But ultimately, I did create that framework. That's what helped me out of the suicide loss. I ended up leaving my 15-year career at that point in time, started my own business, had very, very fast results. I went from literally leaving my other job to being a TEDx speaker probably a year and a half later, multiple press mentions, that kind of thing. So my framework works, and that is what I coach and speak on today.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry that you've had to go through all of that, but it appears that you've come out on the other side. I imagine that being in the position you were in, you obviously were overwhelmed, and that's the topic we're talking about. But what you've seen in regards to the difference between men and women and how we manage overwhelm.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I think it's kind of an unfair comparison, right? There's a huge reason why women, specifically right now in the workforce, are more overwhelmed than ever. And it's because there's more college educated women entering the workforce than men. So it's over 50% at this point. And we are doing even more in our careers. We're very slowly starting to go up the ladder, go into leadership ranks, nowhere near the level that we need to be at to impact change at this point. But in addition to all of that, we're still running households like we did in the 50s. It's an unfair balance when you compare men in roles like that. Really, when you think of leadership in general, you're responsible for yourself and then you're responsible for your team. But when you have women in leadership, especially ones that are caretakers, which is the vast majority, you have yourself, your team, and then your children, your spouse. For folks in the sandwich generation, your parents. So it's a lot to be juggling all at once. So it's really an unfair question. It's kind of comparing apples to oranges at this point, unless you're truly in a household that is split 50-50, responsibilities. So it's kind of a difficult comparison at that point. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, it's not fair. I think that we had talked about how overwhelm affects leadership in general. And there's so many parts that go along with leadership. What part of their lives are mostly affected by overwhelm?
For most of the folks that I work with, it's navigating additional challenges in addition to all the other hats that you're wearing. So it's a capacity issue. And a lot of times when folks start getting overwhelmed, it's one of like 5 things, which is what the framework, the culprits is. It's one of those 5 things that's causing that disbalance. But if you don't take the time to figure out what that is, sometimes it could be a lack of clarity in the situation. A lot of times for a lot of the folks I work with that you're referring to in this question, it's lack of self-care. You're not, it's lack of conditioning. That's the C for that, where you're not taking care of your physical and your mental health. And slowly things become unbalanced. And that's when things start to kind of unravel. But if you view overwhelm from the standpoint that it's not a negative, because I think so many people, they go into the situation with a lot of guilt and shame. It's like, especially as a leader, right? You get to a certain point and you're like, I'm the type A overachiever. I got to this position, like I run stuff. If I admit to anybody that I feel like I'm failing in any area of my life, I know for me personally, I was terrified to have people find out that I was in an abusive relationship. It's like, oh, she accepts that kind of behavior at home. She's not fit to lead here. Those were the silly fears that were running around in my head. But with that said, if you don't take the time and really acknowledge and view overwhelm as simply a sign, it just means like, hey, something in my current strategy isn't matching my current reality. Something's out of balance. I need to figure out what that is. And once you identify it and start to take action on it, you immediately release the anxiety, release the guilt, release the shame, because you're taking action again and you feel productive. And it helps you increase that capacity to show up and lead.
Maybe it is a good time to get into that framework. And then maybe from there, we can kind of work through scenarios or anything that comes up from that. Because I feel like you're referring to that framework and we haven't gotten there. So I want to make sure that listeners have the back.
Right,
work.
sure. It's really, really simple and it's very quick to go through. Anytime you're feeling overwhelmed, it's lack of any one of these 5 things, and they all begin with the letter C. So the first one is a lack of clarity. So it's not just so much knowing what it is you want. You need to know why you want it. You have to have some kind of a vision. You have to have some kind of a mission, a purpose, right? So clarity 101 is usually one of the first things that causes you to feel overwhelmed and misaligned. The second one is a lack of confidence. So it's not just so much to know what it is you want. You have to believe you could do or have it. And I find, especially with a lot of women that I work with in particular, confidence is the one that's really keeping them and holding them back. That's where imposter syndrome comes into play. So you really need to be able to have a way to bridge that confidence gap, which is something that you're responsible for doing. No one else could really do that for you. The third one is a lack of community. The famous motivational speaker Jim Rohn once said that you are the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. So if you're on a regular basis trying to do everything all by yourself and you never ask for help, you're not going to get to where you want to go. On the flip side, if the people you have surrounding you don't know how to do what it is that you want to do, don't believe it's possible, or won't support you because it doesn't benefit them, you're going to stay stuck and overwhelmed, right? So that's key. The fourth one we talked about earlier was lack of conditioning. So that's your physical and your mental health and wellness. If you are pouring from an empty cup, you can't obviously pour into others, right? Or pouring from an empty cup. The last but not least one is a lack of consistency. So sometimes you have all the other four going for you, but you're going to stay overwhelmed if you don't have systems and structure in place to maintain habits, consistency, and routine. So that's going to hold you back. So that's the five.
I love it. Clarity, confidence, community. The one was self-care, and I can't remember the
conditioning.
C you called it by. Conditioning. And then what was the last one again?
Consistency.
So just going back a little, I am not sure whether you coach women and men or just women.
I do both. But my work generally skews higher towards women because women tend to be more overwhelmed in professional scenarios than men.
It reminds me of an SNL skit I recently saw where it was the Christmas and the mom says, I got a shirt, or no, I got a robe. I got a robe. And then everyone else goes through all these things they got, and she's in the kitchen cooking, and she's like, I'm cooking in my robe. And it's just, again, women taking on what is emotional labor. Extra emotional labor is, I think, how we're referring to it these days. You have the 5 C's, and in your practice, whether women are heavy in one area while men are heavy in another, I imagine that a fair amount of cases have more than one of those C's.
Sure.
Like
yeah, it could
adding
be
to their
multiple.
overwhelm. And so let's first talk about what you have seen in regards to where it might be heavier in adding to the overwhelm, and then kind of, if it's more than one, how you might tackle multiple.
Sure. Well, I could give you one right off the bat that's a very common combo would be the lack of conditioning, like working moms, for example. This is usually when I do workshops and stuff and we run polls, that's like 75% of them all feel that way. It's interwoven together with lack of confidence. Because in order to be able to have this space that you need to take care of yourself, that requires you having to say no to other people instead of yes, which a lot of moms don't necessarily want to set boundaries with certain things. And boundaries are essential. And to be able to set boundaries, you have to be very confident, right, to be able to enforce them. So those are two right off the bat that go hand in hand together. If you're looking for a comparison of like men versus women, as an example, with the folks that I've coached, in general, when men are coming to me with challenges, it's usually rooted under the clarity side of it. They're not exactly sure what they want. They don't necessarily have like a vision. Men are very like in the moment. It's like they're thinking about like what's happening right here, right now, not as much forward thinking as women tend to have to be at a necessity because you're always planning 4 steps ahead to avoid having a challenge later. The other one for men too sometimes comes to the consistency side of it. So having those systems, routines, stuff like that, when it's day-to-day things, a lot of them, their partners and whatnot might help step in with that. But in a professional setting, you are responsible for that consistency. So if you are a business owner or you're a leader and things aren't working right, you need really ironclad like systems, processes, SOPs, things like that to really help take that overwhelm off your plate.
I feel like when you separated those two, the men fell way more into the, like, I guess the process, and the women more in the emotional backside, like the background. Okay, going back, because you did touch on leadership, and this is really about how overwhelm affects leadership. Where are the places you see it affect that leadership? So you have these 5 C's that are causing it, but the actual what ends up happening might not. It's a result of the 5 C's, but it's not within the 5 C's. So we had talked quickly about communication. There's communication breakdown when someone is overwhelmed. Kind of what you see as the most visible ways it manifests. The overwhelm manifests and then comes out.
Communication is a great topic to bring on. So like folks who get overwhelmed because of communication. Communication could come from multiple different C's. It depends on that individual. So communication could come from confidence. You know, again, coming back to those boundaries, right? That we're not emphasizing boundaries because we're not confident that they're going to be respected, or we're afraid of what people are going to think about us. Communication issues can arise from your community. Could be that you have people in your circle that really are toxic, right? And it's not you, it's them, right? And you need to cut that communication. Communication could also come down to the consistency side of it. It's, you could have communication breakdowns if you're only talking to your team once a month when really you need to be doing a once a week touch point. So the thing that's great about the system is it's very flexible and really identifies where you are currently at the moment. And that might change, a month from now. What might be causing you to be spinning your wheels and feeling out of control, it might be very different than what's happening right now, but you could probably tie it into one of those 5 things.
I want to go back a little because also I make a lot of assumptions on the show, which probably isn't good, but I tend to do that. I feel as though actually, I'm just going to use myself as an example. I know now when I'm overwhelmed, but I would say for a long time I didn't. Or I was like, nope, you're not overwhelmed. You're not actually feeling that. How do you check in, or how do you know, okay, this has become a problem and I need to take action on it?
You're right. I think even for myself, I was in complete denial to the point where, before the suicide loss happened in my past, I was feeling weird, was the way I described it. So I signed back up for therapy with my long-term therapist to try to figure out why I was weird. But really, I wasn't weird. I was overwhelmed, but in complete denial as to why, that was going on. There's a few different ways that it'll show up. I mean, stress and anxiety is a big one. Feeling of disconnection is probably one of the biggest ones, right? If you're overwhelmed, you're going to start to check out, right? That might be when you're like mentally like doom scrolling on your phone late at night when you should be sleeping, things like that. That's a good sign that you might be overwhelmed. Some folks might end up, it's very, very personal too, in how people express their stress and their anxiety and their overwhelm. Some folks, they might start to emotionally eat, that they're trying to like comfort themselves in different ways. Other folks might get overwhelmed and actually take on more work to forget about the fact that they are so overwhelmed. Right? You try to distract. So there's lots of different ways that it can manifest. I'd say that the number one thing that usually lets you know that it's time to make a change is when no matter what you're doing, it's no longer sustainable. Right? When you have that realization, when you're like, oh crap, like I can't keep doing this. I know I need to make a change. That change needs to start with me, but I'm not sure like what direction you even go in.
Yeah, because usually if you keep going, it doesn't end well.
No. And actually, if you do keep going on that trajectory, it's interesting because I guess you could say pigeonholed a lot of times as a burnout speaker. Burnout is like when you're already well past like you've completely shut down physically, mentally, whatever. What we're talking about is really in that middle section, like in the danger zone. So really, if you're able to identify it and use overwhelm for what it is as a sign and make those changes, you end up avoiding the really, really bad scenario like burnout and being hospitalized and all those negative things that they talk about in the news. That's what we're trying to avoid.
And that's fascinating because I would have assumed that they were together, but that makes total sense that you're in this spot and this spot then leads to that if it's not addressed.
Right. I'm not talking about cleaning up the disaster after it's happened. Like what I tell you isn't going to help with that. What I'm telling you is going to help you when you're in the thick of it before you get to that point.
Gotcha. And so I don't know if this is something you coach on or something you can address, but I also like going back to the like, no, I don't see it. I feel like women are far less to admit that there's a problem. And you even said that you had suffered that yourself for what people might think about it. And again, making assumptions, I assume that there are people that are going to think negatively about a leader being overwhelmed. How might you coach someone to address what is happening, work on it, but also not be so afraid of repercussions or get their head out of that state of mind?
Sure. I mean, I think the very first thing to know is that when you are in that state, it is time to ignore the standard advice that there's personal development and professional development and understand you are a whole human and your stresses at work and at home are taking a part in this. Right? So when you're able to kind of accept yourself as a full person and a full human, right? And it might be time, we talk so much about work-life balance. There are times where you might need to focus on yourself personally if there's something at home going on. For me, when I suffered the suicide loss, it was really difficult for me to be able to show up at work every single day and act like there was nothing wrong. You can't just ignore that. But at the same time, I do think that there's ways that you could be, I like to call it confidently vulnerable, not to the point where I think a lot of folks shy away from being vulnerable in whatever it is that they're going through at that moment because they don't want to be seen as weak. But if you approach it head on and you're like, this is what I got going on in my life right now. This is what my capacity is. This is how I could best serve you today. And I would really appreciate it if during this specific time frame, when I'm giving myself this space to be able to work this out, you have grace with me or this, whatever you need from that individual. Right. And being able to show up and have these kind of very candid, vulnerable conversations with your team. Number one, if you are a leader, it's going to encourage them to come to you when they have a challenge, right? Which you want to be able to help coach people through and not lose them through disconnection. So you're leading by example in that aspect. And also it allows you to be able to manage your capacity in a better level because you're setting, again, those boundaries that we were talking about before. You're setting firmer boundaries in one place so that you could loosen up your capacity in your personal life while you tighten your boundaries on your professional life for a short period so that you could get through it.
So you had mentioned at some point in your answer, or maybe it was the previous answer, you had talked about work-life balance. And I want to look at that because I do feel leaders take their work home and then sometimes bring their life with them to work because they're overwhelmed. And the two might have now combusted.
Women in particular. In particular. I did a study with over 100 working mothers and they were either in middle management or they were in leadership roles. One or the two. They were definitely like past entry level. They were career. They wanted to be, leading teams. And the vast majority of them, when I asked them, what is your number one, pain? What's your number one frustration? They said it's the mental load. It's being able to be fully present at work when they're at work or to be fully present at home when they're at home. It was increasingly difficult for them to be able to manage both. And a huge reason for that is because it's too many things on their plate, right? And without enough boundaries. So this becomes really, really problematic, especially if you're working in like a flexible workplace, for example, and there's no boundaries at all in terms of what time of day people could Slack message you. Because you're never going to be able to shut off, and say, I'm signed off for the day, I'm having dinner with my kids. You're always going to be kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out at any given place that you're at. So I'd say it's unfairly disbalanced that women, I believe, have more of a challenge with leaving the work at work and the home at home than men do. Granted, I do think that a lot of men take their work home with them more so out of desire and ambition, and wanting to do more. Women do it out of straight necessity. They want to actually be able to do more in their career, but they can't because they're balancing all these other spinning plates on the other side that they still have to address.
And is there a way to better balance it out? Are there hacks to make it better?
There are no hacks. I would say it's really being very, very upfront and clear on what your priorities are and learning how to set firmer boundaries. That's so important. And we talked a lot earlier in the episode about different seasons. So you might be going through a season where you got a sick parent that you're dealing with in the hospital, in addition to your kids in school and all the different activities, and you have a project at work. So it might be something that you maybe don't take on the extra projects at work, or you let people know like, hey, I'm maxing capacity. I could do, this for you, but anything beyond that, I need until this day and time to be able to give you more, to create that space in the other area of your life. That's where you get the balance from. It's understanding that we all have the same 168 hours in a week. It's how we intentionally choose to use those hours. And that doesn't change whether you're a man or a woman. We all have the same time. It's how you choose to use it. And women have the same exact choice as men do. We're allowed to say no, though we believe that society tells us that we can't.
Yeah, boundaries are a whole other topic.
Yeah, that could be like a whole, yeah.
I do feel like if we had recorded this episode 3 or 4 years ago, I would tell you that I don't have good boundaries. I have gotten better. But it
Mm-hmm.
does bring on a different level of anxiety too, right? I maybe it's because my boundaries on the outside have gotten better, but my internal boundaries haven't gotten better because I don't necessarily answer emails the day I get them anymore. And
Right.
that's so hard to do. But at the same time, I have the overwhelm and the anxiety of, I should have answered that freaking email today.
Well, in a scenario like that, I love that example, right? Because this is a perfect way that you can, here's your hack. This is a perfect way that you can manage that. So when you're in a season like that, where you're like, you know what, it's really, really tough for me to get on top of answering my email every single day, give yourself some grace, set yourself an autoresponder for a little bit and say, hey, thank you so much for your message. You're a priority to me. I'll get back to you within 48 hours. Give yourself a little bit more time, but you take the guilt and the anxiety off of yourself by over communicating to the other party. You are still important to me. I did not forget about you. I just need a little bit more time. And then when you feel better and you want to go back to daily, just remove the autoresponder.
That is brilliant. That is a handy hack. That is an actual implement this to fix the situation. I want to circle back to before I went off on that tangent. You had mentioned leadership, and I don't remember the words you used. They were way better than what I was thinking, which was like almost the trickle. Oh, it's lead by example. I was going to say the trickle down, a good trickle down kind of
Trickle down
format.
leadership.
Trickle down leadership. But really, that's the expectation, right? That leaders lead by example and do those things. Is there a way to better advocate when you're not the leader to the leader? So, you see that your leader is like overwhelmed, stressed. You may know it. How might they, I don't even know if you advise on that or you coach on that, but how you might approach that to then support upward.
Sure. I mean, I think it's just being human. Never mind like in a work relationship, but if you see that somebody's having a hard time, I mean, by all means, ask them like, are you okay? Sometimes that's all somebody needs to hear, to know like, hey, I'm seen, I'm heard, people see that maybe I'm not all right. And then at least be able to offer like, is there anything I could do to help support? Right? It doesn't have to be specific. You don't need to know exactly what's going on behind the scenes. But I know for when I was in that leadership role and I was going through the suicide loss in particular, and people would be like, you're not okay. Like, you seem like you're not okay. Is everything all right? And I'm like, no, I'm sorry. I just lost my partner, last week. I'm having a tough time. I just need a little bit of time to adjust to my new reality. And getting the support from the people that I worked with, whether it be people who worked under me, colleagues, so on and so forth, was so tremendously helpful, right? And I probably wouldn't have said anything had they not reached out and asked. So I would say just if you're genuinely concerned about somebody, and this goes across the board, whether it's someone you work with, your boss, a neighbor, a family friend, if something seems off, say something. You never know how you might actually impact their situation.
Society these days. That actually brings me to something I want to look at. We're going to start wrapping it up in a little bit, but I want to dive into that a little more from, again, the view of women are far more empathetic most times. I want to look at women supporting women. We had touched on that and the difference that makes. So I just want to look at it from both how women can better support women, but also how the men can better support men, and actually women supporting men and women, and men better supporting women and men.
Sure. No, I think this is a great topic and could probably even have its own episode. Because truth is, especially the higher you get through the ranks, the more competitive it is, and there's less and less women who might be in those levels. And of course, we want to be able to bring people up with us, but it doesn't always work out that way. How do you support others? And really, it's being vocal for the causes that are important to you. And creating communities around that, I think, is a great way to be able to support other women, because not every woman that you meet is going to have the same goals, aspirations, and things that you are. It really comes back to that community culprit we were talking about before. Having the right people in your support circle is going to make all the difference. There are going to be some women that they're just like more alpha, dog eat dog. That's just the way they roll. And they need women who are just like them that could take, maybe a less emotional approach to certain things, where some women really need that really, tight, connected, we share everything with each other type of environment. It's knowing what environments you best thrive in and making sure that you are proactively going out there and seeking the people who are just like you so that you can support each other, and rising yourself up. And same goes for, men. It's the same exact scenario. The one thing I will say that I think is so important, why I am so passionate about getting more women into leadership, is because the more that we're able to do this, the more we're able to show by example to our male allies and more or less get more allies to be supporting women, right? We have to be able to do for ourselves first what we expect everybody else to show up and cheer us on for, right? But if we're not actively out there and advocating and having difficult discussions and taking action and doing the things that need to happen in order for what we ultimately are striving for to be able to achieve it, that it's that much harder to get advocates and other people surrounding us who maybe are not women to be able to support us in the actions.
Gotcha. Again, lead by example. Trickle down leadership.
Yeah. Trickle down leadership.
It's going to be a new term I'm going to start using. Yeah. All right. As we wrap this up, I love to close out the show with 3 hacks. You have given us so much. We had the 5 C's framework. We also had the email responder. I once had one, and then when it died off, I just didn't re-up it. So I need to look back at that. That was super helpful. What other 3 hacks, if someone came to you and was like, I'm overwhelmed in my leadership role, I am struggling with work-life balance, anything along those lines, what hacks might you throw at them?
Got it. So one I have that pops up often is for women who are afraid of starting to set boundaries at work. Like, how exactly do you do that? Especially for ones that are afraid that if they set the Slack boundary we were talking about before, they're going to lose their flexibility. So things like that when you're not setting boundaries out of fear. Number one thing you could do is look at the leaders in your organization and what boundaries are they setting? And then feel comfortable with setting those boundaries for yourself. Because at least then when you're doing it, if anybody calls you to task on it, you could always say, well, so-and-so is doing it. I assume that was okay within our workspace since that was being modeled, right? So you at least have somebody that you could point out and say, I'm doing it because they showed me that it was okay to do it. So it doesn't all come down on you. Again, it's that kind of the trickle down leadership. Really calling on our leaders within our organization and starting to model what they're doing and understanding that, yes, it's okay for us to do that ourselves. That would be one for sure.
I want to layer on real quick with that, really quick. That also brings up the idea that as a leader, you need to set those examples of boundaries because full transparency, I've been in leadership roles before where I didn't have any boundaries. Boards could reach out to me at any time. I 100% access. Everything was secondary to the leadership role. And what's crazy is I had the expectation that everyone else had that. It's terrible, and I apologize to anyone involved with that nonsense that I brought about.
Right, for sure. And then I would say the other one too, which this isn't so much of a hack, it's just kind of trying to think of the right word for it. I would just say it's a good practice to take it to your day-to-day life, is if you have something of value to say, in any situation, whether it be in a meeting at work or with your spouse, if you have anything of value, it does nobody any good at all by you staying quiet. I work with so many women in my coaching practice who they're experiencing either a toxic workplace, that they have colleagues that don't respect them or talk over them, or they've basically been conditioned not to speak up because every time they do, something happens. That not understanding that their power is actually using their voice and continuing to speak up even when that happens. And that when you do it on a regular basis, that's when you get that, there's that whole phrase, respect is earned, not just given. When you are persistent and you just keep talking it up, especially if it's something that you are confident in, that you know inside and out, and people will benefit from what you have to say, it is more or less, in my opinion, your obligation and responsibility to continue to do so, because you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for all the other women behind you.
I think that that's pertinent just to the political climate, even just the world right now. I mean, yes, also in leadership and in your work-life balance, all of that as a woman, but in the world.
Excellent example of this. There is a huge opportunity for Vice President Harris to reach a new demographic by going on the Joe Rogan podcast. Huge opportunity. She ended up passing on it, and this is all documented in the press and the media. She passed on it because she was afraid of what her party was going to think of her if she went on that show. That right then and there, like, that is why this is an issue, just like across the board. You could be in the highest role within our government right now that a woman has achieved, and this still is something that we're constantly carrying with us. And we have to kind of reframe the way that we think about things. Is if we have something valuable to say that is going to help the general public and the greater good, we need to start talking about it and saying it.
Excellent point. Do you have a third?
Man, you're tapping me out today.
I know. These listeners are getting so much. Actually, if you don't have one, let's just go back over everything we've covered, because I feel like, again, you had the 5 C's, the autoresponder.
Yep.
Speaking up.
Make sure you continue to speak up, and then how to practice setting boundaries by modeling the people above you.
Modeling boundaries. All great stuff. Let's go over really quick the 5 C's again. It was
lack of clarity, lack of confidence, lack of community, lack of conditioning, and lack of consistency.
Awesome. And if a listener is out there and they want to learn more about the 5 C's and how to use that framework to then get the proper coaching, how would they find you?
You can find me at my website, corrielo.com, CORRIELO.com. And to your point, I offer coaching as well as speak to companies, women's organizations. I offer keynotes and workshops all about the 5 C's and how to apply them to your work and life.
Awesome. I will put your contact in the show notes. Corrie, thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to today's episode. For all the juicy deets on this episode, be sure to check out our show notes or give us a holler on Instagram at Hacking the Patriarchy Podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support this podcast, don't be shy. Please share it with your friends. Sharing is caring after all. Lastly, if you'd like to lend your personal support, please take a moment to tell the world about it with a review on your favorite streaming platform. We'd be forever grateful. Tune in again soon to enjoy a brand new episode of the Hacking the Patriarchy podcast. And until next time, keep on hacking, my friends.